Okay, let's get started, guys. Thanks all for joining. This is the 14th Big Picture webinar and the first in 2020 or 2020. And we're looking to pick off big challenges with engagement at the centre. What I'm going to be doing this year is compiling a bit of a top 10 league table of challenges facing people development and business development, because that's going to drive a lot of our messaging and content, e-learning, and the events that are coming up. So if you have got any ideas with regard to that, we'd love to know. We're going to pause it as a bit of a poll so people can feed into that. The theme today is about marrying, using processes to marry customer to team. We're going to have a bit of related experience that Richard's going to help us share. We're going to do a little practical as well. It's only half an hour, so we will move at a bit of pace, if that's okay. The takeaway that I want you to have, if I may, if I can help you with anything, is a bit of an insight, some skill that you can apply pretty quickly in your work, maybe next week or in the next few days. So something really practical, and we might revisit that at the end. We play a little game. We're in Zoom. If you've got gallery view switched on, I don't know if you ever played Zip Zap Zop. Is that a game that you're familiar with, anybody?
No.
Right, so think of the order, and if you need, just test the tech in a kind of human way. So the order of the words is zip, zap, and zop. And I'm going to say zip to Lisa, who would then say zop to, sorry, zap to somebody else. So zip, zap, zop. So I'm going to say to Lisa, zip, Lisa.
So I say zap, Tony.
Zop, Richard.
Zip, Martin.
Zap, Joe.
Zop, Lisa.
Zip, Martin.
That's brilliant. We've done it. I do 2 little rounds. I don't know what that means, but I just like it. And it makes us all, and it just breaks the ice a little bit. A lovely lady called Judy Reese gave me that, and I have to give her credit because she's just brilliant at remote facilitation. I'm doing some stuff with her hopefully in the next few weeks. So that just gets us working in Zoom. I will at some point, and maybe as Richard's doing a bit of related experience, I will flip to this view, which hopefully you can see, and I'll just turn off my virtual background. And what I'll be doing, if you see that popping up on mine, you can double click on that and kind of give it a zoom in. I think you can spotlight it or something. I think there's 3 dots in the top right. So if you see me doing something and making notes, then you can like zoom in and see what I'm doing, because that's the kind of big picture engagement element to it. What I would say, if you've got the prop printed out, I sent a link in the emails. If you've got that printed out, I see a few little nods around the room. If you've got that in front of you, clearly you can follow along. The point being, our form of engagement is very personal and human, and it gets people doing things, making connections. And if there's 2 or 3 of you in the same place, it's those joining of the dots that gets everybody talking about the business. If you've got engagement with the employee at the centre, then you can use that as a platform for developing all your people and the business around it. So it's very much bottom-up, emergent, that kind of engagement tool. And I always use the analog human element because that's a big part of big picture. I'll come back at the end how we do that through induction, training, and performance. But let's get into it now. In terms of related experience, Richard, I was so pleased when you kind of suggested that we develop a theme back to one that went before, which was the building the team around the customer. And you said, well, that's okay. And I've gone back and looked at those notes. And what we did is we unpacked the hierarchy in that session. We stepped along the customer journey, which weirdly you can see just going behind me in terms of the yellow line in big picture terms. And then what we did is built the team out from there. But you came to me and you said, well, your experience is that you've used processes to do that, which creates a little bit of a stepping stone. So if I just flick to my other camera here, I went from the customer journey, which is going across the page here with the yellow line, and then we stepped along it using the customer symbol, jumping along, and then what we did is we used the team symbol to kind of join that up. And you were saying, well, there's actually maybe a different way to do that using processes. So just can you give us a bit of description on that, just for others who weren't in on that when we discussed it?
Okay, so I'll try and keep this as brief as possible. If I go back, and it seems quite recent, but it actually was nearly 30 years ago. In the 1990s, lots of banks and building societies in the UK started building life insurance operations to try and capitalize on their market presence. And what was then the Leeds Permanent Building Society went down this route and decided it would have a life and pensions company. And it recruited a chief executive from the life insurance industry, and he recruited the company I work for to build all the systems for the new companies. So we had a blank sheet of paper and we had to build a life insurance company. And this new CEO was a very radical person in the sense that in those days, the people who worked in insurance believed that insurance was not bought, it was sold. The whole premise of insurance was it was so complicated that customers would never understand it. So all you did was employ salespeople to almost beat them into buying the product. And that worked for a long time for insurance. Lots of people ended up with insurance policies they had no understanding of. And his view was, we need to change that. And he said, I want to put the customer at the center of everything that we do as a company. And my job, my role was to design all the systems and technology for this organization. And one way of doing that is to use an approach based on looking at the work of the organization in process terms, looking at the information that comes out of those processes, and turning that into a set of systems and a technology that can then be implemented to run that work architecture. So work architecture is just a posh way of saying the work that the organization does described as a set of processes. So,
and just to pick you up on that point, just to get our eye in, Richard, what I've heard there, and I'm hanging on every kind of word of that, is that if the purpose of that business is around the selling of insurance, may need a thicker pen. What I've heard in big picture terms and what would be possible for other people to understand is that this customer journey line that goes through the center, this yellow customer journey, is where you started. You put the customer right at the center of everything that you did.
Exactly. So the challenge that he gave me was, when I said, the first thing we've got to do is to put together a work architecture. He says, well, you know what I want to do with customer. Tell me how you would then put the customer at the center of that. And what we did, it has stayed with me ever since we did it, was I said to him, well, if you really want to do that, then at the top of your work architecture, the first way you look at it is there are only three things you ever do in an organization. You acquire customers, you service those customers, and then you do work to retain them. Everything else is just supporting that. Now,
but just to pick that off, Richard, because I'm following you: acquire, you service, and you return. Now that's an interesting an interesting compare, because for those not as familiar with big picture as you've been in the past and now is, we're intending to pick up the language that you're using. So because you've used acquire, service and return, that's the language we adopt, because that's how you understand it and that's how you find it best to get the message across. So that's why I've interpreted it in that way. And the service element, is it fair to say that the longer they stay in the center of that page with value being created for them, the best form of business that's possible happens here, because you don't want to lose them and then have to have them to come back. You want to retain them, so they're staying around this area.
I mean, that's generally true. I mean, one of the problems with insurance is if you look at people, if you look at the mortgage industry, which is what we were in, when people buy life insurance to support a mortgage, for example, they're buying policies that will last for 25, 30 years. So part of the problem is often that you sell them a policy on, you know, when they buy a house, and you don't see them again for 25 years. And when you do see them again 25 years, you know, 25 years later, they can't remember who you are. You've actually never done anything to remind them that you kind of exist as an organization, that you care about them, apart from taking their money every month.
Yeah, so is it fair to say there may be a challenge in the fact that in this particular business, there is a time between the value that's created and the point at which they might have another touch point with the organization, which is different to a lot of businesses. It's a bit, I wouldn't say it's an odd business model, it's a special model in respect of that relationship with the customer.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of insurance, a lot of life insurance purchases are in effect once in a lifetime purchases. People buy life insurance, you know, only once or twice in their life. I mean, they may buy it when they buy a house, and they may top it up when they have children. But you know, once you get past that, people don't buy much insurance. So
yeah,
you know, you're trying to find other products to sell them as part of the integrated mortgage and insurance setup, which is why we had a pensions company as well, because obviously at that time it was beneficial to have pension-backed mortgages as well as life insurance-backed mortgages.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things, you know, leaping to a conclusion, one of the interesting things we found about the whole splitting the company up into acquire, service, and retain is that nearly everything that's important about retain is done in the acquisition process.
Right.
You know, the way you acquire a customer sets the tone for whether they're going to stay with you, whether they're going to come back to you, or whether they're just going to treat it as a one-off distressed purchase and hope they never see you again.
Yeah.
And obviously, servicing does have some elements of that, but the servicing you do in a life insurance policy is not much. You know, it comes down to things like name and address changes, changes of direct debit details. You know, people don't actually come to you very often once they bought the product. So the trick is almost all the time is to make the acquisition process as smooth as it can be to almost build that trust with the customer so it lasts for the life of the policy. And a big part of that comes down to the design of the products.
Yeah. Can I just jump in there then, Richard, to get on to the process? Because what I've done, I'm hovering, and Rebecca's joined us, which is great. We'll just keep going because time will be upon us. When I'm representing that, what I'd love to go into is a conversation, and this is what happens with Big Picture. When we engage people with a structured conversation around the business, we get into an interesting conversation around the business model, and I get as excited about that as anybody else in terms of engaging the business and the different left and right and ups and downs of it. In this specific chat, I've got my symbols for processes and team here. On this backdrop of this acquire, service and retain model with its various challenges, could you talk a little bit about the types of processes then you use to marry that customer to the red team symbol?
Well, before I do that, can I just explain where teams came into this? Because in a sense, the whole genesis of this conversation with you was about the fact that when we started off, we didn't have any teams. We didn't have an organization structure. Mm-hmm. And we deliberately set out not to have an organization structure until we had been all the way through the work architecture and designed all the work of the new company. You know, so I did that with a small team that worked for me, but we were contractors, and we designed it with the executive team. And we had one or two experts already recruited, who then helped us with the detailed design of some of the functions of the organization. So, you know, we designed the processes, and then we designed the functions that might look after those, not the functions themselves, but the functional perspective. So it's easy to work out, where customer service and product design and product implementation fits into a process architecture. It's a lot harder to get the expert view into how that should work. But what we didn't have until the very end was teams designed around that work architecture, and that was deliberate. What we had said was it makes a lot more sense to have the team designed around the process, which is designed around the customer, than it is to try and design the process around the team.
Yeah.
And I've always believed that works, even in organizations that already have teams. The teams are often wrong. The alignment of the teams with the work of the organization is often wrong, which is why you get work scattered across organizations that falls over as it bounces from one department to another, one person to another, because it hasn't been designed, to achieve a specific purpose. It is just a historical legacy of how things have already been done.
So do you think
we designed the teams right at the end based on the work that was in the work architecture? In effect, we just drew circles round processes in the process diagram to say this looks like it is one group of, one bunch of work that will best be done by one team with this sort of skill set, with this sort of orientation. And that's how we started building the organization structure.
Yeah. And that's the kind of image I've got here in terms of making notes, that we've got the customer to the process, of which there are two, one in service and one in retain to the teams. And I'm just wondering, where I did remind me, Richard, when you were talking, that you had the ability to design those teams because it was in effect a little bit of a startup, if that's fair to call it. It didn't have the team.
It was completely a startup. So we were able, we didn't have the vested interest that you get in most organizations, where if you try and reorganize things, to fit the process, the work of the organization, the teams are already there say, well, I don't really want to be reorganized. I'm quite happy with the way things are. Even though those processes don't work for the customer, the organization is able to exert some inertia, by saying we don't want change. But yes, we had the advantage of being a startup. So we had a clean sheet of paper, and deliberately we went from, through a cycle that said, design the work first, design the information second, design the systems third, design the technology fourth, then design the organization. And it worked. It worked for us. It worked. Yeah. It worked perfectly for the short period of time in which the Life company existed.
Yeah. And just a question then, Richard, before we get into a bit of practice and practical around this, is that would it, I guess, like with anything, there are some processes where that's easier to do and some others where it's more difficult, just to test that out a bit? Does anything spring to mind? Because it would be lovely to think it worked every time in all circumstances. I'm just trying to gain an insight that might be useful as to the areas or what finds a process where it's easy to do that and do that circle drawing exercise, and other areas where it's more difficult.
So I think, where it's easier, we're in parts of the service part of the work architecture, where, as I said earlier, you're not doing lots of complicated servicing. So it made sense, in effect, to have one team of people who could handle all the service inquiries, and most of the people in that team could be multi-skilled to deal with multiple inquiries. So maybe not every person could deal with every inquiry, but everybody in the team could deal with multiple inquiries. So the team was quite easy to design. If you look in the acquisition part, one of the problems, I say problem, it was a sort of problem, that when you change from a value chain driven approach, which is what most people do, to a customer approach, one of the problems you've got is with the people who create products and services. Because in the value chain driven approach, those people think that they are the most important people in the organization, because if we don't have anything to sell, then we don't exist. In the customer driven approach, those people are subordinate to the people who in effect carry the customer torch. And what you're saying to the product people is, when you design these products, you're only designing them so that somebody else can sell them. They're not in themselves important only insofar as they meet customer needs. So now most product people say, well, of course we start with customer needs, but lots of product people, particularly in insurance at that time, did not start with customer needs. They started with the technical analysis of the types of product that other people sold and designed new products accordingly. We kind of ripped up the book on that. We started off with the customer and brought in product people and almost retrained them in how to do product design in insurance. So that was quite difficult because some of those product people who were used to, who some of them were actuaries, they were quite unused to being in effect lectured to by people who looked like they might be marketing people.
Yeah.
That hadn't happened before, but it's what we had to do to make certain that those people had that customer focus and that we could not only design products that the customers would want and could buy, but products that certainly could be understood by those potential customers, which had never happened before.
Yeah. No, that's lovely. I'm just going to pause for any thoughts from Lisa and Tony. I think Rebecca's walking and Joe as well. Any thoughts at this point before we get into the practical? Because I would like to try some of this out before we finish. Tony, from you.
Yeah, I've just been like putting those 3 topics actually across on my worksheet that you sent over, and just thought actually, yeah, that would really simplify my business. If you just add acquire, service, retain.
Yeah.
So I've just been putting some notes under that really, and
yeah.
Yeah.
The interesting thing with that, Tony, and the point I briefly made, and it's a really key point, is when Richard uses those words, if he understands that to be the business model, I think sometimes we miss the opportunity to cherish what I call good information. So if Richard has spent a lot of time cogitating and thinking that's how the business looks, when he says that, we capture that and we use that. And I know it's just a brief example, but it's all about putting the employee at the center. If someone says that, then we use that. We don't then say, well, it's easier for us to call it operations, marketing, and customer care, which you notice is the writing I've got on the template, but then we encourage people to write over the top. And that's just a key point about a form of engagement where people have the ability to express their own view as opposed to being told or broadcast to. And that's the point. Thanks for that, Tony. Lisa, from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to hear this. It's difficult for me to kind of put this into the same context as the sort of business that I work in, because we don't quite work in the same way in terms of our customers. But just thinking about us as a customer and how we are acquired, serviced and retained, I think the important thing for me is the service element to it, in that if you as a client feel like you're getting the good service, then not only will the organisation that's doing that retain you, but they're also likely to acquire other clients, just because of the sort of nature of construction work that I'm in. If you've got a construction company who's done a good job for you as a client, then you make that recommendation to others. And we're talking about some sort of sizable contracts. So for me, that service element's probably the key bit, not just for retaining, but also acquiring. So it kind of goes both ways.
Yeah, and do you think that structure would be understood in the same way by colleagues, or do you think that conversation would be like an easy one or an interesting one because people might have different perspectives?
I don't think for the sort of organisation that I work for, it follows in the same way, no.
Okay.
So I don't think that sort of model, I understand it, but I understand it more from looking as us as the client that's being serviced, because we don't have that sort of model. We don't need to acquire clients. Yeah,
interesting. And that in itself is, we've had that chat before about what the customer, who the customer is and the client, and what that means in because you're not going out, as you've just said. It's just reminded me, you saying it has, the penny has dropped there. It's a difference in that side. It's about how the person that you deliver value to comes into your world in generic terms as opposed to thinking about customer acquisition or member acquisition in terms of Joe's sense. Just keen to go to Joe as well. Thanks for that, Lisa. Joe, anything from you at this point before we go into the practical?
No, I think I kind of agree with everything. Well, obviously, we do indemnity, so very similar to insurance.
Yeah.
And we have started becoming a lot very, very member first. And the division I work in is part of the AER team, which is obviously acquisition, engagement, and retention. So yeah, I can see lots of similarities there, and making sure that we do have that member first, that the key, which is really key, to be honest.
Yeah. No, that's excellent. I don't know if Joanna, because Rebecca's on mute because I think she's walking outside. So I won't go to her just in case she's finding it difficult to communicate. And I know she's following along. She's chatting to me in the text. Just on to the practical. I'm aware of time. We haven't got much time. I've just pulled up a brief sheet and I just wanted to test it out with something, Richard. Maybe you can help for speed. If I go through the example I'm going to use, what I'd like you all to do, if you can, either flip the sheet over, or if you've got a second sheet, that would be great, but just follow along with the same patterns. And the idea and the example I came up with, and we haven't rehearsed this, Richard, so thinking on your feet time, I make bespoke furniture, totally different types of business. Bespoke furniture is here, and in the past, this is a business I'm familiar with as a customer, and this is the area here where there's a factory, and I actually used this example in the previous webinar. And the challenge and where I've thought about this business differently from what you've said is that because this business does bespoke furniture, in the area of what is traditionally called marketing, they do say that they will start to understand the client needs in this marketing area here. But what I've realized in applying some of the principles that you've talked about is that the process here in marketing that they use to set expectations with that customer has got a challenge, because what it doesn't have within it, it doesn't have anyone from the team, the factory or the engineers or the designers that are actually going to do it here, reflected in the acquisition or the marketing area. So that knowledge is not in the right place. And I think if we'd approached it using your technique or your suggestion, then maybe what we may have done is what we would have done is decided that the process within marketing requires that knowledge, to not simplify it too much, knowledge of the actual way the furniture is put together and constructed, which would mean any expectation setting going on in marketing was clearer to the customer. And therefore, when they got through to the factory, they weren't disappointed with what they'd been told. And I think that's made me think differently about the way I may go about that conversation with that kind of business. Is that, what would your observation be on that? Do you think that's a fair example, or have I gone down a rabbit hole or off on a tangent? Or one of those metaphors?
No, I think that's a very good. I think that's a very good example. I mean, it's a parallel with my experience as a consultant when I worked in delivery of consultancy. One of the problems we had was the salespeople would go out and sell work, and then come back and say, we've sold this, and it's going to, we've sold it for $200,000, and we'd look at them and say, well, we can't do that piece of work for $200,000. You should have taken one of us with you on the sales call so that we could have had that conversation with the client early on to, as you say, manage their expectations. So what you're really saying is that the acquisition process, when you draw the process map out, in effect, parts of that process has to be done by the delivery people as much as some parts of it are done by the salespeople. So you're building an acquisition team that draws on different functional expertises across the organization, and is not in the ownership of a single team. So you build a team around the process of what's the best way to sell our products in a way that makes certain they will be delivered in a way that meets the requirements of the customer, because you can sell people anything in a sense, but you can't deliver always what you have sold, and that's where it all falls to pieces if you can't deliver against the expectations of the customer. So I think that's a good example, because that works both in services and in products. That you know, that you have to have linkage between the ability to service the customer's requirements, you know, which is started in the acquisition process.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Thanks for that. I think with time upon us, what I'd love you to do, if you have made some notes and you're willing to take a picture of them and send them in, then the dialogue could continue. We've hit our half an hour, and I'm really grateful to Richard for taking us through that and everybody having a go and contributing. The 2 points I would make before I just go into my close, which is, I think we've chosen a simple example there, but I think in the time that we've had, with the principles that Richard's described and the example used, we could take that pattern, and what we've seen there is putting the process first, it would pull some skills out of another part of the business. And what I'd be looking to do as a bit of an insight and a thought for next week is how that pattern could be applied, that same pattern, but in a different part of the business. So instead of pulling expertise and skills out of the factory into marketing of bespoke furniture, how could you take skills out of customer care and deploy them in another area of the big picture templates, such as management and administration? Or one example that's just come to me, which I've seen in big picture sessions, is customer care skills into relationships such as suppliers and partnerships, which is probably something Lisa's got a bit of a background in the suppliers and partnerships. Well, what we're talking about here is the ability to think about the customer first, the process second, and looking at that holistically and organically and seeking to find where the skills come from to best fulfill that. But what I would say, big picture, is very much about the engagement element of that. So there will be textbooks of business process engineering where that approach features, but it's much more powerful with an engagement wrap around it when you've got the symbols and the ability for employees to play their part, and actually it comes from them. And just like we haven't rehearsed and new things have come out, by giving people the symbols and the framework and the structure within which to express themselves, new things come out, new connections are made, challenges and opportunities. And we could have gone on for a lot longer, and I feel like we've curtailed that conversation far too short, but that's what we do in a webinar. I will now sweep up and remind you that those are the kind of features and benefits that Big Picture brings in the form of the kits that we provide, that you can see behind me. We provide the symbols and the kit in all different sizes, both physical and in the future. There'll be an app available in the next few weeks to collaborate in this type of environment. We use that kit in workshops, both open workshops and in-house workshops, where the team need to come together as some event. And then we turn those workshops into a series of activities for people development and business development, such as induction, training, and performance in the people space. And in the business space, we do a lot of as-is and to-be work, which is probably what we've talked about more today. I'm thinking on my feet, but it's more of a business development type of pattern, which is no surprise knowing Richard's background more recently in the legal space around change transformation. So today has probably been a bit more of a business development theme, where we have people development themes as well. So I will seek to close. I don't know if there's anything anybody would want to add briefly at this point.
I was just thinking, just for me, one of the things that made me think about, the customer experience. And this is where I struggle with process design, is that what is the experience that we want the customers to have at each of those stages before you have a process? And the process in this example seemed to have come first. And then the other thing is about, the agility of teams that maybe you wouldn't have if you really wanted to service a customer. You'd have someone from acquire, service and retain as one team, not have teams acquire, service and retain.
Oh,
that's just where my thoughts were going.
Oh, that's interesting. So actually, I'm just holding up the little customer symbol. You see that yellow line behind me, Tony? that's our customer journey line going from left to right. And I think from what you described is at each of those points, there is a different type of feeling and experience that the customer kind of has there. And it's actually getting that right first fundamentally. And we skimmed over that. And I think absolutely right. Yeah. The earlier webinar talked about like the 4 or 5 key touch points through the customer journey behind me. And I think we maybe skimmed over that one in this one, but it shows that from a value and principle perspective, that's getting that right first is essential before looking at the next step, which would be the processes and then on to the team. So it's actually quite a methodical approach. You would have to be good enough at the step before you all look at each other and nod and say, right, that is good enough to go on to the next stage. Is that fair, Richard, from your experience?
Well, I mean, I think that the point is absolutely brilliant, because that's exactly what we had to deal with. Because my role on this big project was as the work architect, and one of the problems we had was exactly the point that Tony's made, which is how do you know what customer experience to stick into these processes? So how do you build the experience you want into those processes? So the functional design that I talked about very, very briefly was the way we in effect dealt with all those topics through the experts that we could lay our hand. And actually, in preparing for this webinar, I went back through my labs and I dug out one of the functional design documents that we had written, which was called the Product Realization and Customer Service Experience document, which was kind of about 30 pages of design documentation that said, this is how we want the customer to experience our products and to experience the servicing of those products. And we developed that at the same time as we did the work architecture. So my job doing work architecture was to say, these are the things that we have to do as an organization. And what the functional design people said was, and this is how. So as you're doing what, we'll tell you how. And then we could then, as we decompose the processes, we've gotten down, we took each process and broke it down, and we broke it down again, and we kept breaking it down. So we got to the point where you didn't want to break it down any further. But in doing that detailed design of the process, we could then bring in that customer experience, that how you do the process, the way the experts in the company wanted the thing to work. We could then build it into our process. So you're right, we kind of did process first, experience second, but we also did them at the same time. The process wasn't finished till the experience was in it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And a lot of customer journey work I see being done today is actually done because the process has been designed badly in the first place. So we have to go back and look at it in terms of a customer journey and then say, well, this isn't kind of what we meant to happen. And it certainly isn't what the customer wants. So now we fix the process backwards from the journey. What we were trying to do was to almost get the journey right from the start.
And all I would say on that, Richard, is that in my experience, having a central single version of the truth, which represents at a summary high level in an engaging way that everybody can relate to and maybe stand at the front of the room and point at, just in the way they would do a whiteboard or flip chart. But my experience is that using instantly recognizable symbols that are in effect the dots that people join is a very human and accessible form for employees of any background. And I mean education, social. From the diversity webinar, we went into how it's all about the view of people rather than their physical characteristics. It's giving everybody a chance to have that voice, because I think everyone's got a voice. The receptionist, the guys in the factory, the marketing guys, it's coming together and using symbols is one way of engaging people in a tactile way. I'd love to go on, but I've got to close there. I would just like to thank you all. Joe, I've not come to you so much, Are you okay? And is there anything you'd like to add? I think she's on mute, so she may have forgotten that. Lisa, are you okay?
I'm good, thank you. Yes, it was all very interesting.
I love it. Yeah, it's really good. There's loads of themes there. What I do is I'll blog about it. Assuming everyone's okay with the recording, I'll put it out there. I'll break it down. I think there's been some really good points made there. Back to the plot, that there's hopefully an insight somewhere in there that has made you think a little bit differently about what you might be doing over the next few days. And if it's achieved that, then that's great. Make the connection, have the chat. Let's play with different examples. There'll be another theme in 2 weeks' time around people. Business development. I think the next one is agile. We try to pick off the trickiest issues around and tackle them with the engagement wrapper. And I wish you all a very good weekend, and thank you all so much for being a part of Big Pictures webinar, and wish you all the best and chat to you soon.
Thank you.
Great weekend.
Bye.
Bye.